When Congress adjourned June the 16th, 1933, they basically ended that first 100 days, a period during which Roosevelt and his administration pushed through Congress, and Congress supported the passage of approximately 15 major pieces of legislation. It was an amazing, amazing amount of legislation to come through Congress in that amount of time. And yet, for all of that, Roosevelt, throughout the 1930s, would struggle to deal with the problems of the Great Depression. I tend to kind of accept the notion that it was not anything Franklin Roosevelt did or his administration did that ended the Great Depression. Rather, if we want to understand how the Depression came to end, we probably need to look to the Second World War. Primarily because of the massive amount of federal spending that the war entailed, things like defense contracts, but also because of how the Second World War altered the global economy and sort of the post-war position that the United States had after the war. So to kind of, I guess, add some substance to that, let me suggest a few statistics here very quickly. In 1933, there were approximately 13 million unemployed in the United States. Now, if you consider the size of America's labor force in 1933, that would be approximately 25% unemployment. That's 1 in every 4 workers who were looking for a job. And I know we haven't seen anything like that since the 1930s. 1936, Roosevelt's policies apparently were having some good effect. The number had dropped down to about 9 million unemployed, and that had dropped the unemployment rate down to about 16.9%. The problem was, and this is a bigger problem for Roosevelt in the 30s, that in 1929, the unemployment rate had run somewhere around 3.2%. So while Roosevelt's policies clearly improved the situation for many Americans, they didn't necessarily bring the United States back statistically or otherwise to where it had been at the end of the 1920s, that sort of decade of prosperity. And what that does really, it opens the door to criticism of Roosevelt and the New Deal. And he'll see during the 1930s plenty of criticism from both the left and the right. Or put another way, Roosevelt will see plenty of criticism from people who would argue that he had gone too far, had exceeded the constitutional powers granted to him as president, had usurped powers of Congress as the executive. But at the same time, Roosevelt would face criticism from people who vociferously argued that he simply wasn't being radical enough, that the changes he sought to make to bring back, to revive the American economy were not fundamental or structural enough to really help the mass of the American people. So Roosevelt is sort of taking it from both sides, and so is, as a result, the New Deal. Some of the more specific arguments made against Roosevelt had to do with taxes, that in some instances they were too high, with budgets. Some said that Roosevelt was being too conservative, while others complained that he wasn't being conservative enough, that he was more than willing too easily to deal in deficit spending. There were those who argued that Roosevelt's policies subverted this idea of individual initiative, that people should pull themselves up by the bootstraps, that they should be entrepreneurial, that they should work hard to get ahead, and if you made them dependent upon federal monies, that they would lose that incentive and thus lose the values that had made the United States, that had made it as successful as it was. There were others who criticized Roosevelt's policies for favoring big business. It was often the case, for instance, with the National Industrial Recovery Act, that the blanket codes were being set by the largest players in the industries covered by those codes, that they had an excessive say in how the codes were constructed, and often used the tool of the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, to benefit themselves and their big business interests. So you're getting it from all over. I think it's not an unbalanced view of the New Deal. Roosevelt's New Deal was not salvation itself. It was not the saving grace of the Depression, and yet it did have positive effects. But I think it's also worthwhile to consider that the effects were not equal for all groups in society. And I just want to mention very quickly a few examples that kind of appeal to me just a little bit. I mentioned before that in 1933, under the auspices of the AAA, that farmers had plowed under crops. And they plowed under somewhere around 10.4 million acres of cotton in 1933. They killed 6 million hogs. That's a bit of bad publicity when people are starving, but the depth of the change, the depth of the impact goes a little bit further. And let me just suggest a couple ways in which that happened. One of the sort of unintended consequences of the AAA was effectively the removal of massive numbers of people from the land, massive numbers of farmers from the land, from farming. And it works something like this. Under the processes put in place under the AAA, the parity payments, those payments that were to be given in exchange for farmers not growing so much to reduce supply, those payments were intended to go to farmers who were farming, and that would include sharecroppers. But the distribution method for those payments often went through the landowners who owned the land on which sharecroppers farmed. Throughout the South, to provide one example, it made no sense for landowners to share the payments from the federal government with sharecroppers when it would be just as easy to remove those sharecroppers from the land, to refuse to renew contracts and just say, well, you're on your own. Why not just keep the money? It's your land and you're not growing crops on it. The payment is meant for you. So in essence, you have what's been called a modern day enclosure movement. If you're familiar with the enclosure movement going back to England, in which farmers were excluded from the commons, well, the idea here is that farmers are excluded from land, and they're not landowners. They're sharecroppers. Whether or not you're removed from the land, it does become harder and harder without crops and without payment to stay on the land, so it may well be that you'll remove yourself. The number of sharecropping farms dropped from 776,000 in 1930 to 541,000 in 1940. Now, there are a number of factors involved here, but there are numerous cases in which the primary factor forcing people from the land was that they could no longer grow crops and they received no remuneration from the government for not growing crops. So they move on. And that adds, it's worth considering that adds fundamentally to the continuation of the Great Migration, this great demographic change that I've talked about before. That's just one effort on my part to sort of complicate the New Deal. But in terms of the actual voices directed against Roosevelt's New Deal, let me, in the next segment, sort of specify and run through those. And we'll start there.